Good afternoon. That's very loud. Okay. Good afternoon. Hello. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. No. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, perfect. So, look, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon at the end of the day. My name is Charlotte Lindsay. I'm the Chief Public Policy Officer of the Cyberpeace Institute, and I will be moderating this session today. The first word of the session, of the title of the session, is Unpacking, which in a room which is completely packed with people is probably not such an appropriate word. So formal and informal entities that offer cyber capabilities and services primarily for intrusive purposes, such as commercial spyware, to provide access on third-party systems without their consent or knowledge, to survey, capture, or manipulate data. So the cyber mercenaries phenomenon contributes to the rapid and uncontrolled proliferation of offensive capacities by stockpiling and exploiting vulnerabilities to develop their products and services. So this unchecked growth of this marketplace poses a direct and serious threat to the global stability of cyberspace, as well as to individual and collective rights. And this is the reason why it must be urgently addressed at both national and international levels. We have 10 expert speakers around the table today. We are splitting the session into two parts. There'll be short interventions by 3 speakers, and then we will open to all the speakers around the table, and then a second session of 3 speakers, and we will open to all of the speakers around the table. So the first part is going to focus on the architecture, dynamics, and associated harms of the cyber mercenaries ecosystem. And I'm very pleased to ask Agnès Callamard, the Secretary General of Amnesty International, to start the first intervention.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Paris Peace Forum for prioritizing this topic. So I think the key message I want to deliver in that short amount of time is that human rights harm, human rights abuse, human rights violations is a feature of the industry. Cyber security, cyber spyware, however you want to call it, mercenaries. It is not a bug. It is by design meant to violate rights. It is by design meant to violate the UN Charter, because it's a form of aggression. When you use cyber surveillance on the territory of another country, when you use cyber surveillance to target the head of another country, that's a form of aggression. So the UN Charter is violated, and these are not incidental. It is part of the package that is making it attractive. This is what the industry is about. It's about selling rights, violations. It's about selling violations of the UN Charter. It's about selling instability. And until and unless we understand that and make that central to our attempt to regulate or to transform deeply that industry, we are not going to be successful. So the term mercenaries is absolutely appropriate. The rest I have to say are details and elaboration. So what am I, let me just put forward a few more empirical evidence. So targeted, unlawful targeted surveillance, which is the one we're talking about, violates a broad range of human rights, individual rights. It chills expression. It instills fears. It is a form of gender violence as well. It has a destructive impact on individuals, and I can tell you it kills. Having myself investigated the killing of a journalist, that killing was made possible because of cyber surveillance before, on the territory of another country. it is often impossible for targets to prove the existence of surveillance, either because of technical hurdles, the covert nature of its use, the fact that it's forever becoming more and more performing. So it means that there are very few opportunities for reparation, remedies, justice. The scale of the tools, the scale of the problems is massive according to what we know, and it's probably far greater than what we know. So in 2021, Amnesty International and others documented how just one company, NSO, was able to sell highly invasive spyware to over 20 countries, and that it was used in at least 45. But we have no doubt that the actual number is likely higher. Similar companies are present in Europe. Last month, as part again of a coalition, we published a report on how invasive surveillance technology supplied by the European-based Intellexa Alliance are being sold and transferred around the world with impunity. The thing about those mercenaries is that, they exist. They are not hiding. They are companies. Yes, may be not straightforward to follow, who all their shareholders are, but, it's possible. They are public. I mean, they are there in the public space. That alliance, Intellexa, has used various mechanisms to bypass existing EU export regulations and control on dual-use cyber surveillance product. So for us at Amnesty, that finding coming 2 years after NSO findings, we see that as a catastrophic failure to regulate the use, sale, transfer, and export of spyware technology by the EU. We worked in particular on one very awful spyware that is called Predator. I think it's very appropriate. We have identified individuals who were targeted. Now, it's difficult for us to assess whether the target also meant that that they were infected. But we know that the President of the European Parliament, the President of Taiwan, US members of Congress, a German ambassador, a French MP, UN officials were all targeted. Despite repeated revelations, repeated scandals, a shameful lack of accountability and transparency has contributed to an atmosphere of impunity. Investigation in the EU and other regions have been stonewalled and failed to stop the unlawful use of spyware, and these must change. We are calling, of course, for better regulations, and I know that this is what we're talking about in the next session for some of it, but in keeping with what David Kay had found several years ago and that we keep putting forward, it is our position that the highly invasive spyware in its current format cannot be regulated, and therefore the only approach to regulation is to ban it. We urgently need to ban highly invasive spyware, and I want to repeat it, it is not an afterthought, the violation and the harm. It is not an accident, it is not an incident, it is a design. It is designed to violate our rights, and it is designed to be creating of instability in a world which, frankly, does not need more instability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnès. That's a very good introduction to the problem, and particularly the focus on harm and violations to people. I would now like to hand the floor to Omar Ben Jacob, who's a cyber and disinformation reporter with Haaretz. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and not just because I'm the only one not in a suit, which I think I deserve some credit for. So I'm the cyber and disinformation reporter for Haaretz. That's Israel's good newspaper I think that cyber and disinformation are weasel terms. They don't mean anything. Cyber means digital, and disinformation means weaponizing information. I would argue that that is actually a very important point to start with. Just to quickly kind of follow up on what was said, I'm not going to talk about the harms at the human right level because I'm not an expert at that, and I think that point has been made quite eloquently. But I want to offer a slightly different perspective that also ends in a different point. So I'm of the belief that you cannot ban this, that you have to regulate it, and that the question is how it should be regulated. And therefore, the framework I usually try to offer or bring forward is actually a very non-technological one. I think the right framework to understand digital arms through is through privatization. What we're seeing, these cyber mercenaries, which I think is it's a good term, but it's also it kind of obfuscates what we're talking about, are actually privatized form of defense contractors. We've had arms dealers for quite a long time. I think there's something dangerous about giving them different terms because I think it undermines our ability to talk about this in a way that connects with other discourses that we have, regulatory discourses, legal discourses, ethical discourses. Within the cyber mercenary space, I draw a quick distinction between service providers, quote unquote hackers for hire, and what I like to perceive as arms dealers, so companies like NSO and so on and so forth. What makes Intellexa so scary is that they are a combination of both. Generally, from what I understand, hacking for hire, at least from my country, is illegal. So you're not supposed to be able to provide that as a service, while selling digital arms is something you're allowed to do. Selling digital arms does not involve just the sale of specific spyware. Spyware is just one thing that is sold. Anyone who's sticking around Paris will know that there's another conference happening here in which these kind of technologies are sold. So if anyone has a few $1 million and wants to go with me, we can go purchase some electronic warfare gear. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that the spyware specifically and cyber arms function within a wider arms space. Signal intelligence, open source intelligence, many different types of intelligence and arms, or I would say types of defensive technologies that work together, and some are regulated, some are not regulated. Why is this kind of an important thing to talk about? Because now I want to talk about Israel quickly and what we talk about the harms. So I can't talk to the human rights abuses because I think that's been well established and I think it's a known point. I want to talk about other harms that people don't usually think about or don't necessarily perceive to be a direct harm of this. So, for example, I think the Israeli example is quite interesting because I think we actually ended up paying, and this is the only time I will speak as if I represent Israel, Israel paid a price for its cyber diplomacy. So even if you're a government, let's put aside the human rights discourse. Yes, if you're a government and you have national security, geopolitical interest, it's not necessarily clear-cut, at least now we can see in Israel, that pushing out these technologies the same way you would push out guns to evil regimes actually pays off. So it's actually quite dangerous. So if you're arming problematic regimes, it's true also with guns and other things, it's also true with cyber arms, and I think this kind of backlash that Israel faced for this is actually a very important lesson, because I think in Europe countries are still allowing this kind of stuff to be sold from their territory and don't understand that you can actually get in trouble. I think the second point I would like to make is actually a tactical point. So I think there's a lot of discussion about human rights and not a lot of talk about the actual implications of using this and what that risks. So I can't go into too much detail, but I think what current events in Israel show something very interesting that I don't think a lot of people noticed. It shows the military danger of being obsessed with cyber and being obsessed with cyber diplomacy writ large. And I mean that both in the very naive sense of, we have tons of cyber stuff, but we didn't function at a physical material level, but also at a broader level. I think the Israeli defense establishment, like many across the world, are enamored with this idea of cyber. And by treating this as something that is somehow disconnected from the rest of the world, or the rest of our military kind of operation, you do actually end up missing very basic forms of intelligence that I think in the 70s people could collect. So just for context right now, Hamas is using walkie-talkies, yeah? This was also an issue in like Vietnam. You don't need cyber to deal with this, right? And I think that's a very, very important point. And I think what I like to call tech blindness is actually a huge issue. So if you're obsessed with cyber and you think that cyber is everything, you're going to miss a lot of other things. And I think from our perspective, what we're missing is that we actually have a very rich tradition of regulating arms in many, many, many ways. And it's in our interest to not buy into this innovation discourse. This is not something completely new. This is the continuation of things we've already seen. The needs, the same way guns inherently threaten human rights, then we need to start thinking about it like this. So I don't know that I have the solutions, but I think this broad historical framework or of privatization is important. And again, just to kind of the people representing governments in this country, in this room right now, Israel ended up paying a price for the fact that it sold these technologies to irresponsible regimes. Selling this to irresponsible regimes harmed us de facto, but also harmed us politically, but also harmed us in a real way. So there was actual cyber issues that arose over the past month or so that were the result of the fact that Israel had let other people use its technology. And I think people forget this. When you sell certain technologies on, you may also end up losing the ability to do that. And I say that as an important caveat or addition to the human rights debate, which of course is very important.
Thank you very much. I would now like to ask for the last intervention on this section from Craig Jones, the Director of Cybercrime at Interpol. We've talked about crime. This is a great moment for you to come in. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So as the Director of Cybercrime for Interpol, I'm responsible for a global programming for 195 countries. Interpol, as a neutral organisation, are only able to, in the crime area, so anything political, military, racist or religious, we have to exclude ourselves from that. So we start at a very common principle within that. So police are there to protect communities and prevent harm. That's our role at the end of the day. The policing model is built on a local model. So we're very good at policing locally in the communities that we trust and patrol. In this space, it's a whole different environment for law enforcement. How do we cooperate? How do we collaborate? How do we share that information and data where we've identified threat actors or infrastructure in a country? And when you look at the criminals, they're mainly in this for financial gain. So the harm they are causing is a very high harm and cost to our communities globally. This area around cyber mercenaries is one part to that. It is a crime in some countries. In some other countries, it may not be a crime. So when we're dealing with this and trying to coordinate operations and investigations, it can be very challenging within that space. So the programme looks at prevention, detection, investigation and disruption, and who in our community is best placed to deal in that area. So who's best to do the prevention? We're dealing with a technology here. We're dealing with processes. We're dealing with people. So in terms of who provide that technology, are we able to regulate global technology from a number of countries that come together and say, this is bad, we need to do something? Yes, we need to do something in the first instance, but actually, how do we prevent that? So what are the technical solutions that can be built into that? So actually, we reduce it at the point where it doesn't actually impact on someone because the vulnerabilities in the systems and networks have been reduced. In terms of detection, how do we detect it? Law enforcement do not have the capabilities to detect that, but we are able to partner with private sector, other organisations as well, and we're able to then aggregate that. How do we then investigate that? That's law enforcement bread and butter, but if you look at a lot of companies out there, they've got their own investigation departments. So actually they're carrying out effectively a law enforcement type function. So where is the responsibility for that? And finally, if you look at the disruption, where is the disruption done, which leads back to the prevention effectively? So how do we disrupt? So law enforcement are able to do arrests. They are able to take away someone's liberty. They are able to seize funds. They're able to seize assets. But when that goes through the court processes, and how many global court processes have we had so far in cybercrime, and how effective have they been, and how long have they taken as part of an investigation? So the law enforcement model in this international area is being rethought at the moment. As Interpol, we've laid out recommendations, we've laid out the resolutions which have already been signed up to by our 195 countries about countering and combating cybercrime. We're also part of the ad hoc committee at the United Nations, which is looking at a new international convention to counter the use of information and communications technology for criminal purposes. That really just trips off the tongue very, very nicely. But again, that will provide the first international convention or crime convention in over 20 years for law enforcement. So in terms of laying out some of those instruments globally, this is really important. But just bringing it back to the cyber criminals and looking at how the cyber criminals operate, yes, they're doing it for financial gain. We have terms like mercenaries, we have cybercrime as a service. There's a lot of different terminology out there. Sometimes it is quite confusing for the communities, and I'm not dumbing it down here, but you're talking to the communities and you're talking about security by design, you're talking about zero trust. Yes, most people in this room have some sort of cyber interest and we can talk in that language. But when I'm talking to my mother about how do I protect her online, there's no point me having that conversation. When I talk to my 19-year-old son, or sorry, he's 21 now, apologies. When I talk to my 21-year-old son and look at his online behaviours, it's quite frankly shocking. Because the awareness that we have to build into our communities, how do we enable that safety online? So as part of our programme and our project going forward, that's what we're looking to do, and we're implementing that through a regional model. So we are putting a global perspective into the region. So, for example, in Africa, we have created the Africa Regional Operations Desk for Cybercrime. We're funded by the UK under a project. We have seconded officials and contract officers working in Africa now. We have a framework for those staff to work to. This didn't exist 4 years ago when I sat in Nairobi in a classroom with the cybercrime leads of those countries. We have now developed this. So we do training, because Interpol is very good at doing training, but we always have an operational objective within that. So in this case, we're looking at compromised infrastructures and ISPs. If you'd asked me I was going to be doing that in 1990 when I joined the police, I would have laughed at you. But, we are now training the law enforcement officials to go and have those conversations with the internet service providers, say, you have compromised infrastructure here. It is breaking legislation in your country. Here's your legislation. Or it's breaking the terms and conditions. That then leads on to that disruption, but more importantly, it leads on to future prevention. So I think I'll stop at that point and hand it back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've heard from three different perspectives: a human rights perspective, international security perspective, and also law enforcement. So now I'd like to open the floor to the other speakers around the table. Who would like to take the floor, please? So I hand the floor over to Monsieur Léonard Roland, who is the head of International Cyber Policy Unit for the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlotte, and good afternoon, everyone. So the way we look at it from a French perspective, the way we look at this phenomenon is the following. For years, we've been following three main sources of threat in the cyberspace. There were state-sponsored groups, there were criminal groups, and there were hacktivist groups. And now it's been a few years already where a fourth category of actors is emerging, which are the private sector offensive actors or mercenary firms, as you want to call it. The most visible part of these activities and products is, of course, the spyware part, the spyware subset of these whole categories of threats. And there have been numerous reports over the last years of misuse of these capabilities, attacks against journalists, human rights defenders, parliamentarians, or political espionage against political authorities. This is, of course, unacceptable, and we condemn this kind of misuse of such capabilities. That's precisely the reason why France was among the first to join the joint statement on the misuse and proliferation of spyware that was adopted last March in the framework of the Summit for Democracies. And we intend to live up to our commitments in the framework of these joint statements, whether on establishing national guardrails for the use of these capabilities or improving export control mechanisms. And that's exactly in this period that yesterday, within the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we hosted a kind of unique multi-stakeholder meeting precisely elaborating policy options on how to regulate this phenomenon in a multi-stakeholder format. So there was the civil society, there was government representatives, and there was the industry. I think it was the first time we had this kind of conversation, and it was a very useful one. But now, spyware is only part of the problem. There are that many categories that we tend to forget that also contribute to these cyber private offensive ecosystems. There are the building blocks to build malicious tools, for instance, exploits and vulnerabilities. There are ready-to-use products, such as spyware, and there are the whole variety of offensive services. And then behind this, there is the whole ecosystem that makes this industry possible, like investment firms, for instance. So therefore, we should also enlarge the scope of what we are trying to regulate, because it's not only about surveillance. Maybe tomorrow it can be also about disruptive or destructive tools that will be possible to buy off the shelves. So it's both a human rights issue, but also a cyber stability issue. And I really liked Madame Calamar's expression about the vendors of instability. I think it's perfectly right. So it's maybe the future of cyber warfare, and we need to prepare for it.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to hand the floor to Kaya. Kaya Siglic, the Senior Director of Digital Diplomacy of Microsoft, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlotte. And I would just, I feel like we're in wild agreement, and maybe just add a little bit, maybe a couple of examples to what you're just saying. I think, from a Microsoft perspective, in addition to human rights, the worry is the instability of the online environment. It is the fact that some of these actors stockpile vulnerabilities rather than report them to the vendors, so the vendors can't fix what's wrong in the systems. The problems are that once the systems are broken into, other actors can go behind them, right? So it's not necessarily just a targeted actor that acts once. Once there is an open door, others can follow criminal groups often very quickly, and I agree with you. I think it is a broader problem than spyware. It's also a broader problem than just the defense industry, I would say. I think there's defense and uses in defense. There's uses in intelligence. There's uses in law enforcement, but there's also uses for private individuals or other private sector actors. We worked with our colleagues with LinkedIn just earlier this week to disrupt an actor. We refer to it as Blue Tsunami. And if I look at their web, you can find it. But I'm not going to name them besides with that acronym. But their website is effectively: winning your lawsuit depends on securing critical information that seems impossible to obtain. This company specializes in high-profile litigations, arbitration, and white-collar crime cases. Leave it to us to uncover the facts, no matter where they're hidden. And so, it is a private offer to people like in lawsuits. So I think just thinking about it more broadly in terms of who uses these tools, and I'm also with you I'm on the regulatory side, because I think that's the only way. I think the uses will happen. We need to figure out in what context, with what oversight, and how do we protect human rights as part of it.
Thank you. I'd now like to hand the floor to Tim Maurer, Senior Fellow from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Normally, I don't go about promoting the book that I wrote, but for this session, I thought it's worth mentioning because the title of the book is Cyber Mercenaries, and it was my PhD. And I will share a little secret, which is it was not supposed to be the title of the book. I had proposed cyber proxies, but the marketing department of Cambridge University Press thought Cyber Mercenaries would be a better title. Now, the reason this matters is, as part of my 6-year research, it turned out that cyber mercenaries as a term is not very helpful. It's ill-defined in international law, and it means a lot of different things. And I think we have now heard a number of different topics already covered under this issue, from vulnerabilities to ransomware to commercial spyware. So what I'd like to propose is, as we move forward in the coming months for how we think about this ecosystem and the marketplace, to be very precise about what piece of the puzzle we are talking about, because they're very different in the nature of the problem set. I should also add, what I'm saying now is in my personal capacity. I left the White House in May. I'm no longer representing the US government. But what I'd like to do in a couple of points is, to me, this is not about one company or one country. It's about a broader marketplace. There are a lot of companies out there that do offer very similar services, including here in Europe. And the instability, in my view, or the source of instability, is not tied to the fact that governments have outsourced certain capabilities to the private sector, because this goes back to the 1980s, Thatcher, Reagan, and it's a governance phenomenon that we see in many different sectors. So to me, the source of instability is rather tied to a level of control and principal agent theory and the extent to which governments can hold those actors accountable that they hire for certain services. So I very much agree with your comment that, to me, this is a question about how you can regulate this ecosystem. And I disagree with the notion that you cannot. And I will share two anecdotes for why there's evidence that what governments are doing is having an impact on those companies. One, in the early days of this discussion 10 years ago, you had a company called Gamma Fisher operating out of Germany and the UK, where export control licenses were applied. And the company started moving around jurisdictions to Switzerland, which then also denied a license. So it was clearly having an impact on the company's behavior and was disruptive to those companies. Second, I was writing a piece about Hacking Team, which was based in Italy, and Hacking Team subsequently got hacked, and I learned about their internal deliberations when I ran a draft op-ed by them, and they discussed whether to answer or not. And it turned out they were able to know who some of their customers were after delivery of the product and services, because there continues to be a service arrangement in many of these instances. And a lot of these companies aren't just selling the tool, but continue to provide additional services that you can buy or purchase. So I do think this is a marketplace that can be regulated. It is very difficult because we are talking about software, but I don't think it is infeasible. And I also believe that while I recognize the importance and the rationale behind the call for a ban, having worked at the Department of Homeland Security for advising the Secretary of Homeland Security as a cybersecurity advisor, DHS is not only in charge of immigration, as most people know, but also has two law enforcement agencies as part of the department, one of which investigates child sexual abuse and exploitation. And there are cases where some of these tools is important for law enforcement purposes. So I do not believe that a call for a ban is the politically most sensible political capital spent in the coming months, because the environment we are in right now is that there are a number of governments that are willing to take action to regulate this marketplace. And a call for a ban at this particular moment in time is going to strengthen the people within those governments who would like to not see any framework and who will get very confused by a call for a ban, because then they will say, we're not going to support a ban because we will want to use it in one way or another. Which leads me to my last point, which is, I do think we're a very unique window of opportunity in the coming months for everybody in this room, assuming most of us are like-minded, that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And I wonder whether we can get a little bit more creative. Amnesty International, I think there's an opportunity to think about whether there is a campaign in 2024 that helps make cybersecurity and cyber threats less abstract, that highlights the journalists that have been targeted, the activists, in particular in Europe. Because while the European Parliament has been very focused on this, this is an issue for EU member states, and we look forward to seeing more action, but it's clear that there is, I think, more room to be, for actions to be taken. For Interpol, I think there's a question to what extent Interpol and law enforcement agencies can come to some sort of agreement or framework for how they use some of these tools as part of their investigations. For example, you could come to an agreement that even if law enforcement agencies buy these tools, that they should only be used within a country's borders, because law enforcement is only taking place within national borders, and you would at least address the remote nature of some of the transnational threats that we face with commercial spyware. And the last one may be, to your point about the other conference taking place right now in Paris, maybe for the organizers of the Paris Peace Forum for next year, there could be a joint session between the Paris Peace Forum and the other conference to share some of those ideas and to get reactions from the very marketplace that I think also has an interest in clearer rules, because it's their business, and having more clarity will allow them to continue to do business, but hopefully in line with human rights.
We will definitely need a bigger room next year. The last word I would just give on this section to Brad Staples, the Chief Executive Officer of APCO Worldwide, and then we will move to the next section. So please, could I ask you to keep your comments short? But I will give you more time on the second section. Thank you.
I'll be very quick, and I just wanted to pull together a few strands from what everybody said here. I'm part of this session because of the work we've been doing supporting the Cybersecurity Tech Accord since 2018, and it's a group of 155 tech actors who are looking to address security questions and matters of peace in a multi-stakeholder context. And I was very pleased to hear what Leonard said earlier about the multi-stakeholder context in which discussions are taking place right now. This is one of the few places you will hear good industry actors recognize the need for regulation and recognize the need that security will only be achieved through regulation. We sit having this conversation with a backdrop of a new dynamic in terms of the private sector and state actors addressing cyber risk. We actually have a cyber war, the first hybrid war taking place in Ukraine, as we sit here having this conversation well into its second year. So I think it is, the cyberspace has been created and is managed by industry, by private sector, by tech actors. They're there helping to identify and disrupt the role of cyber mercenaries, documenting, reporting on their activity, and actually supporting legal activations to address the issues that they're dealing with. So I think it's just pulling those strands together. There's a crucial role here for the private sector, the tech sector, in all these forums.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to just move to the second part of the session, which is focusing on achievements and way forward in international action against the irresponsible use of cyber mercenaries. What room for multi-stakeholder coordination? And I give the floor to Tim, please.
I already shot my fire, so I'm going to yield to the other speakers and also the experts we have in the room, because I know we have a lot of others that can benefit to the contribute to the conversation.
Thank you for making my job easier in terms of time management. Now I give the floor to Will Middleton, who's a cyber director from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom. Please, the floor is yours.
Great. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for running this session. I think we're delighted to be part of it, and it's great the genuine kind of mix of participants you have, which is absolutely necessary to fix this problem. It's hard, perhaps, to disagree with anything that has been said, but let me add kind of a few aspects. First is, I can violently agree. I find myself in the very happy place of violently agreeing with my French colleague, because earlier this year, the UK and France agreed to work together on this issue to tackle this phenomenon in the broadest understanding of the problem that Leonard set out. But as Leonard and I and our teams go around the world with many of our kind of like-minded colleagues, we find the understanding of this issue is really quite low. So, you know, we may be sitting in a room with a bunch of experts, but on the whole, most governments have not really thought about this problem. So that's my first point. We have an advocacy job to do. My second is we cannot simply talk about it as a problem in the context of a national security issue or counterintelligence, or simply as a problem of human rights and rule of law, or simply a problem of commercial or trade competition. It has to be approached from all of those perspectives. And that is in part because this cannot be fixed solely by a bunch of like-minded countries, many of whom, frankly, are just represented around this table. It's great talking to ourselves, but we need to engage with those who are users and enablers of these products. And therefore, we need to couch it in terms which resonate with both those users and enablers, as well as maybe the like-minded participants around this table. And that is fundamentally about the issue of stability in cyberspace. It's not about democracy. It's not about human rights per se. It's about not perpetuating instability in cyberspace. Now, human rights matters fundamentally to the UK, but that is not going to be the argument that gets all these many of these enablers around the table. But then let me just talk about some of the principles that we take to approaching this problem. The first is whether we would choose to or not ban these things, we are not going to eliminate these capabilities. And we do not want to drive them underground. That is, there's a real risk that an overreaction just drives this underground, and a too narrow response amongst a few like-minded countries does not bring in the kind of scope that we need to tackle it. The second is that we need genuinely a multi-stakeholder, multi-state response. So we've often found in multilateral negotiations on cyberspace, it's heavily state-dominated. It's frustrating that the principal forum for discussion of cyber behaviour in cyberspace, state behaviour in cyberspace is the UNONWG. It excludes most of the stakeholders that we need to fix this problem. So we need to bring together a broader coalition to do this. And as I say, we need to engage the enablers and the users as well as the like-minded democracies. The third point is we need to attack this problem from the full life cycle, from the funding all the way through development, marketing, and end use. We need to look at how we can constrain irresponsible use through all of those steps. We've looked at this, and there is no silver bullet. Export controls alone are not going to fix this problem. Regulation can play a role, but nothing on their own is going to fix it. And we're also realistic that we are not going to, as I say, eliminate the problem absolutely. And the final point is the importance of all of us living up to the principles of responsible cyber behaviour. We talk about this in a state context, but we need to apply the same principles to industry as well. And I speak to a lot of companies who are very keen to be seen as responsible actors. So there's a role for us to define what that responsible behaviour. We, in the UK, we've set that out, talking about the levels of oversight and accountability, adherence to international law, a strong domestic framework of regulation and oversight, independent oversight of our intelligence agencies. These are all criteria that underpin responsible use. We need to hold others to account for the same sort of principles. And finally, UK is, along with France, working with others to try and illustrate the problem and identify solutions. And we in the UK are hoping to host a conference next year to bring together that multi-stakeholder group we've talked about, states, industry, civil society, both to expose the problem and raise awareness, but also to start to compose the coalition we think we need to tackle the problem and identify the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then finally, I would like to hand the floor to Anne-Marie Bassatou, who is the Executive Director of ICT for Peace. Please.
Thank you so much, and it's really a pleasure to be here today and wearing the multi-stakeholder hat again. I think that this is really important. I think absolutely regulation is key, and we need to come up with good regulations on national and international level and try to harmonize them as much as possible. But I also agree that regulation is not enough. And when we look at how a multi-stakeholder configuration could help really shore up some of the gaps in regulation, I think we need to look at some more creative, have some creative approaches to this. And there are different ways that you can regulate this, bearing in mind that these are companies that are selling these products. So we have a lot of regulations that actually can be developed to apply specifically to companies, how they use them. But also, let's go to government procurement. You can include in your contracts with contractors that use that they don't use these kinds of software or spyware. And if they do, their contracts are cut. They don't get them. They don't get paid. And that's a financial incentive to actually prevent the proliferation. Let's put, and in addition to regulation, I'm saying that regulation is great, and we need to have it. It's challenging on the international level, as you know right now, especially with the geopolitical tensions that we have. But let's have a kind of mosaic around the same standards of how we can then try to prevent, combat, stop as much of this as possible, and also raise awareness among the different actors, including companies, including governments, including those who are buying. I think that there's often an idea that if it's for sale and I can buy it, then I can buy it and it's okay, without the further understandings of the implications. And just for a moment on the point of stability, I think stability of cyberspace is also a huge thing, and it's something that we can really sell. But as you said, so many governments don't get it. lots of us don't get it. And, you know, we have lots of cool tech. How many of you have had to pass a test to, like, use these? Like, what's a responsible way of using tech? You know, we can post it online. We can click on things, and we do this without very much awareness. And we're also part of the problem. So I think that education is also a huge part for all of us, multi-stakeholders, whether we are governments who can regulate, can also enforce, but also our clients and have the power of procurement to enforce that. We have the companies, the good ones, that will hopefully really use, you know, implement this into their policies and how they're actually deploying tech. We have civil society, our voice, which I think is so important to talk about how these technologies are impacting us and really giving that feedback, like what are the real harms and impacts of these? And then, you know, from a stability point of view, we should all be using these things more responsibly. We need to try to make this internet work better, make it more secure, not break the internet. And, you know, maybe it would be a little bit safer. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I now open the floor to anyone else who would like to take. So firstly, I'll give the floor to the person who hasn't had the floor yet. So please, Eileen Donoghue is the Special Envoy and Coordinator for Digital Freedom of the US Department of State. Yes.
Used to being in government yet. So I really agree with, you know, the brilliant and compelling way, Agnes, you put it about this is a feature. Human rights harms are the essence of this, not a bug. And these tools are meant to violate human rights. On the multi-stakeholder front, it is obviously civil society that has made that visible and compelling to everyone. I think the really important shift that has happened and changed this conversation, though, is a recognition that previously binary opposing concepts of either you care about national security or you're an intelligence person or you're a human rights person and you think those people are terrible. The big change is they've come together. And here I beg, you know, the United States, I would say we have a slightly different twist on this. We really do see it genuinely as a human rights issue because that's a national security issue. And so they are really bound up together, and the leadership in our government, it's been remarkable for me to see from the outside and now the inside. It's deep and organic, that sense of link between those two sides of the coin, and you can't solve it if you go one side or the other. So I just want to say the highest level U.S. government, from the president, you know, and its closest allies in the White House, have chosen to make this a priority, particularly focusing on commercial spyware. And I think the first step they took was recognizing, get your own house in order. You know, and the United States has perhaps been a poster child of certain issues related to intelligence and spying. And so it was really a big move to say, you know what, we see this as a national security threat, in part because it's a human rights threat. And so we're going to deal with it, and we have to deal with our own use, our own procurement. And there was an executive order that basically saying we're changing the rules about what happens in the U.S. government. But also now this broader international effort to lead on this subject, where at the Summit for Democracy, there was a joint statement with 10 governments partnering. And now there's an ongoing, very concerted effort to expand that tent and elevate this issue, as many of you said, with other governments for whom they're not really seeing it, they're not feeling it, it's not yet a very compelling thing. And I will say one of the problems we've recognized is that as we all discussed yesterday, some of us on another conversation, it's such an unwieldy issue because it touches many parts of government. And many governments we've gone to feel like they can't get their own interagency processes to come together. And that's a challenge we have to address with best practices. But I think the other big part of it really is that the narrative itself is not yet as compelling as it needs to be for governments or for the publics of every government. And David Kay made this beautiful point yesterday that we need to make the stories of the victims more compelling, and that is both civil society actors, opposition figures, journalists, and diplomats, leaders of governments, all of whom have been subject to these tools. So that's the work we all have. I'll stop.
Thank you very much, which is a good moment to come to Agnès, because I think talking about the victims, talking about people, this is at the center of this, so the floor's yours.
Thank you. And also because I have to rush to another panel. There was an overlap, so I'm really sorry. Look, very quickly, we absolutely acknowledge the many efforts and progresses that have taken place over the last few years and that have been mentioned. The US Government Bureau of Industry and Security and entity list for malicious cyber activities, I think for us, was extremely robust response, and we really welcomed it. As we welcomed the executive order prohibiting the US government from the use of commercial spyware that poses risk to national security. The effort to counter the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware by 11 states, the fact that 45 states have endorsed new guiding principle on the government use of surveillance technology. I mean, there are things happening. We cannot deny that. It's, there is an awareness. However, what we are finding is that, maybe because it's the beginning, these are not yet translating into fast enough actions and impact, given the nature of the industry, its hyper development and its capacity to, to counter a lot of technological tools that you may want to use, let alone regulatory tools. So we feel that time is running out, and we really would like to encourage the international community to work faster, to work harder at regulating the industry as a whole. Second point, we need to also understand, of course, that there is a market for at least the spywares I'm talking about, a market made up of government. So, that's where the difficulties of regulating that industry comes as well. So the fact that governments are buying that tools, governments are attracted by that tool for the reasons you were pointing out in an era of huge attempt to control the future. Clearly that industry is at the heart of any kind of hegemonic vision, and we are also facing that reality that I think governments are, have a double, a little bit schizophrenic when it comes to the regulation of that particular industry. So this is why, while we welcome all those changes, while we welcome and support those initiatives and we'll want to be part of it and to look for human rights-centered guiding principles, human rights-centered ways of assessing the impact of those tools, we believe that a moratorium on some aspect, on some of the spywares, which I don't have the time to describe now, will probably be the most effective way while we put together the regulatory system. Of course, the moratorium will be violated, but to have a moratorium in place for the most dangerous tools, while we take a little bit of the time required to put the regulatory framework, in our view, will be far more effective to at least counter and mitigate the multiple harms.
Please, I've been told that we can carry on for an extra 10 minutes at the end, so please...
Yes, just before I rush to the UD
Tim,
chart,
please, because you put up a challenge of a campaign, but I'd love to hear where this is going. Tim, please.
Just quickly, because I do think if we think about the next 6 months and civil society pushes for a ban, what will happen within governments is that those who are the champions within government for human rights and who are trying to regulate the space in a more strict way than it is currently, these champions within government will spend more time than with the other counterparts within government of explaining the ban and what is driving the ban. And a lot of time within government will be lost because the champions of human rights within government will be arguing with other parts of the government about the nature of the problem. If instead, for the next several months, given the interest of governments, civil society focuses on putting stricter frameworks in place, given the announcements that governments have made, I do believe governments will spend less time internally with the champions of human rights within those governments of having to fight those internal battles and are better able to potentially put a framework in place. So just a food for thought, because I do think we are at a unique moment in time and there is a risk of potentially losing that window.
David, you'd need to come up here so you're on the speaker. So please take Agnes's place. Can I do the next? If I do the next speaker while you're settling, and then I will come to you immediately. Please, Craig.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I really want to be very, very quick. I think that we're being, maybe I'm anti-semantic here, if I can say this, because I think that in some ways, the US government has already, in effect, normatively expressed that certain uses of technology are effectively banned. I mean, the blacklist is a kind of ban. And so I think that whether we're talking about a ban, I mean, I agree, we don't need to talk about a ban, but I think that there is a move towards saying that some uses of technology are in fact illegal under international human rights law, and those should be off the table. Whether we call that a form of regulation or we call it a ban, may not make all that much difference. But the one thing I would just sort of historically, as we think about this, is we had a very similar situation with landmines, not that long ago, where you had a set of governments, most of which, I mean, some of which are in this room, who said, like, we're never going to ban landmines, right? And then one government said, actually, we are going to ban landmines, and or at least we want to ban landmines. And you had two tracks. You had a ban landmine track, and you have a regulatory track, and both of those today coexist. So I think that, like, for civil society, if it's 6 months or whatever, I mean, thank you for the 6 months, though, by the way, but I think there is a way in which, if civil society doesn't see that there is meaningful change in the actual use of these tools, then it will be very hard for them to say, to sort of gather a campaign around, like, what do we want? Or, regulation. I mean, I'm sorry, that isn't going to work in the same way that what do we want, a ban, will work. So I think the pressure is kind of on here. And I think that as the public becomes more aware of how these tools undermine fundamental democratic values, they'll become more alive to this kind of issue. And so it might move in that direction. But anyway, thank you for giving me the...
Please stay. Craig.
Thanks very much. Just sort of picking some of the points up about, driving this underground. So effectively, either way you go, it will be driven underground. So it will still exist, it will be underground, and it will make it harder to then disrupt. What current tools and mechanisms do we have to disrupt this? So coming back to a sort of programmatic approach to this, underpinning all of this is trust. So when you're talking about this, who trusts who? Who are you talking to? Who are you trusting and who you're involving? And the current mechanisms that we have, and if we look, and this is a personal opinion here, of US work around ransomware, that kicked off because a report was done, and it was to align the US entities to come together against a common crime type. 3 years later, we have 50 countries sat round the table. There are positive steps coming into that. I think we need to look at what current mechanisms we have and how we can utilise some of those current mechanisms. Whilst you referenced Interpol about Interpol being able to do certain things, there's certain things we can't do. So understanding organisational capabilities and capacity and making sure that we do use those levers that are currently available. And I think through forums like this, we're able to highlight, well, actually, Interpol is able to do X, Y, and Z, but we're not able to do A, B, and C. And this has taken sort of 5, 10 years to get to those points, and we're going to have to keep developing that further, but making sure we're not duplicating and using the mechanisms that we currently have and using them effectively as well.
Thank you. Kaya, please.
Thank you, and I'll be super quick. So I would, because Charlotte, you can't do it. I would basically position the Cyber Peace Institute a little bit. I think that there was calls for more effective storytelling. I think just over the past month, the Cyber Peace Institute put out a series of really fantastic little videos, including on cyber mercenaries, together with G0 Media, so the Eurasia group. So go take a look and spread them. I think, I agree completely. I think we need more storytelling like this. And then governments will have their their backs turned out a little bit, and maybe you won't get in all the rooms at all times. But I think I think the pressure from civil society is super welcome.
Thank you. Omar, please.
Yeah, so I'll quickly jump on. I think I have to be honest, I disagree with the representation of the U.S. policy. I think it's good that the Americans put forward a framework that says if you misuse this technology, then that can become a problem and put the onus on the usage. I think to represent that as a ban is not fully accurate. I think the American message to this room and to the world is that when America hacks your phone, it's not illegal and it's fine. And that as long as it's in line with Americans' interests, not human rights, Americans' intelligence and counterintelligence interests, which anyone who knows the history of the past 100 years will know is actually two very distinct things. And I think that's very important because the point is, and that leads to the second thing we've been misrepresenting, which is governments are not actually the clients of this. We pretend as if it's Biden buying it from NSO. That's not true. It's agencies and different agencies within different governments. And I think I want to connect all those things together because the problem is that it's being sold to law enforcement agencies and not to armies. And they're specifically to countries that have been unable to develop it for themselves. And I think that combination of those two things is actually quite easily regulatable. You can, for example, not ban the use, but you can say we don't allow this to be exported, for example, and we don't allow it to be sold not to any specific country. It's not that Guatemala is good or bad. It's the question is who in Guatemala is buying this, yeah, and who in Europe is buying this. And just to circle back, I think that to me those are really salient points. No police forces. No countries that can't make this for themselves, and I think that would do quite a lot. The second point I want to make, and then I'll let go, is that I think when you think about how that sales pitch actually works, so who the person is buying it, it's not the president of the country. It's a long chain of people who represent what you call system integrators and resellers, and you actually have a very big echo chain, I would say supply chain. And the metaphor I like to give is that you can't buy a nuclear bomb on Amazon, right? So America and Israel allegedly have nuclear bombs, and we're okay with that, and we also have found a way to break down the different sides of that. So, for example, you can't sell uranium, and I think exploits would be a similar interesting way to think about that. And I think in that sense, there is a very big spectrum between ban and not ban, but I think there's also a real risk, as Tim is talking about, that we lose real actionable things. Do not sell a nuclear bomb to a police force, and it doesn't matter if it's the NYPD, or in France, it doesn't matter. No police force should have this.
Thank you. I'm coming now to Brad, please. You've been very patient.
Thanks, Charlotte. I just want to pick up on something that Anne-Marie said earlier, that regulation is not enough, and just call out the good work of the Cyber Mercenary Working Group under the Paris Call, which is issuing its guidelines this weekend. And they include measures to on export controls, on transparency measures, vendor verification, blacklisting, as well as oversight requirements, a full package there of non-regulatory measures, but guidance that the Tech Accord is going to lean into and drive for governments to take those new guidelines very seriously.
Thank you. Leonard, please.
Thank you. Unfortunately, Will had to leave, but I wanted to jump in on his proposal to have a conference in 3 months from now in the UK, precisely addressing the whole market of commercially available offensive tools, and that's a conference that we are co-organizing with the UK. I hope Lancaster House will be big enough to provide all of you with a seat, because I really want the conversation it's a very fascinating conversation to go on in February. The second remark is about the and I can only encourage this working group to continue working also in the details of policy recommendations, and I think it's going to be very helpful in the run-up to the February conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anne-Marie, please.
Just to echo and maybe take it one step further, the calls to have the stories, to really make this human, to see what the impacts are. We need to do that. We need to put a human face, something more than cyber mercenaries. But then I think we need to do the next step and analyze how might this or does it violate the international human rights obligations that we've all signed up for? We may find that these things are effectively banned if we really do the analysis, the legal analysis, and understanding what those obligations are, what states have said that they're going to do, and what the gap is between. Things like whistleblower protections for companies. You know, sorry. Things like whistleblower protections, so that employees that see things like this that are happening in their companies feel that they can speak out and be protected and not be, blacklisted. There are a lot of people, they don't want this to happen, but maybe they're in a situation where they really feel they can't. So we need to make it possible for people, as many people, to speak out as possible.
Thank you. And Tim, please.
I look forward to the event in the UK. One quick thought on the cyber stability framework. I do think as we break down what cyber mercenaries mean, I do think there are different categories also if we're talking about what is available in the marketplace for industrial control systems in terms of pen testing capabilities, et cetera, and thinking about whether there is a level of severity that can be applied, or the vulnerability issue, which with respect to cyber mercenaries, is something where we see more governments adopting a vulnerability equities process that clarifies how government are handling vulnerabilities, which is another component to this, which we haven't touched on yet. I just want to briefly respond to your point, because I was in the government until May, and I was responsible for the administration's Advancing Technology for Democracy agenda. And I will say that this administration has cared a lot about human rights. There is a human rights directorate within the National Security Council. No government is perfect, certainly not the US government. But I will say that the actions this administration took did not come out of the blue. It was thanks to the work of Citizen Lab and others who for 10 years have been writing about this issue, and it's been on the front pages. And there are other governments and companies that could have taken action a long time ago. So for the US government to now belatedly take action, but in line with human rights, and because there was a counterintelligence risk of the US government itself being hacked and the US government believing that US taxpayer money should not be used for tools that are used against the US, is part of the reason why the US is taking these actions. So I just wanted to briefly share the perspective from the US government on that particular point.
Eileen, you
Well,
want to
I do think that is the light bulb that went off, is, oh yeah, these tools can be used on us too. And the second thing is, in terms of what the U.S. has done, the executive order actually does prohibit agencies from using commercial spyware if it poses a national security threat or is likely to be abused and used to violate human rights. So there is a little more teeth. It's not just the president. It is the whole of government. And same thing with the efforts of export controls. That's economic, treasury, like lots of people, the entities list. So it may not be perfect, but there's more teeth to it than may meet the eye.
Thank you. I am not going to try to summarize and conclude everything that came out of the last session, but I think there are a couple of phrases that I've heard that I think are really important. Tell the stories and make this resonate with all levels that need to understand, be that the person on the street or government and everything in between. That also getting our own houses in order at an individual, technical, at organizational level, on government level is a really important start. But also importantly, to finish maybe on a very positive note, there is a pressure or momentum which seems to be moving on this issue at a time of highly complex negotiations and difficulties to move on so many things. So how do we leverage this momentum that we have now? How do we move this forward and make sure that something very positive comes out of that to move forward on this, the regulation that's going to be necessary. Thank you all very much, the speakers who are here, and also all the people that stayed and stood through this. Thank you very much, because it's been a very interesting discussion from my perspective, but I think very tough for all those who had to stand and listen to this, so thank you very much.